firstly, just let me say kia ora koutou, kia ora e te whānau to the Bay Vineyard tribe. It's nice to be able to speak, and I desperately wish I was actually getting to be with you today, but just put them in lockdown.
Yeah, Dan, just so everyone knows, Dan was actually meant to be speaking this Sunday, so alas, he's stuck up there.
I'm stuck at home, and you at least can go get coffees now. Yeah, I'm a pastor's son, but actually I'm also a church planter's son. So my parents planted the church that they pastor still to this day, back when I was 14. So I spent my teenage years being the guy on Sunday afternoon who would load all the sound gear into the back of the station wagon, and we'd head into the town, and we would set up this sort of cafe style thing, and we'd put on this church plant. And that's basically, since that point, that's just been me. Like, I've been in on that story in all kinds of ways. And my dad worked really hard. My dad is a hard worker, just like I think you're saying about your dad too, Sam. There's no faulting their work ethic. That's one of the things they're driven by. It's actually a high marker for them of being a good person, I think. Bernard of Clairvaux, he says there's two things you should know in life. Number one, who you are, and number two, that you are not who you are by your own power. And I think when I look at my story with my dad, I look at what he formed in me, and what he formed in me was a work ethic. That's one of the things I received from my dad as a formation. So my dad taught me to work hard, and I would often work really, really hard every context I was in, whether it was working for a farmer as a summer job, whether it was my first jobs outside of design school, whether it was when I showed up to Auckland and started pastoring. I worked hard. And I remember this one moment, one time where we had to do like timesheets for working at Central Vineyard at the time where I was pastoring. And I, for 4 weeks, was proud that multiple times in those 4 weeks, I was working heaps of overtime. And my timesheet would end up at like 65 hours a week, or, like I was trying desperately to, I guess, show how I'm a hard worker. And then it all just started to kind of unravel, because of course you can't keep that up, can you? You can't keep that pace up. And the way it unraveled is I had to learn to slow down. So I had to actually learn, man, in life, there's this accelerator, but also there's a brake. And in the fruit of the Spirit, there's accelerated fruit and there's also brake fruit. Like, there's things that stop, there's patience, there's things that slow you down. In the practices of the church, there's acceleration, there's things to engage in, but also there's things to stop with, there's things to hold with. And I've had to learn those for the good of my soul, the good of my marriage, the good of now my parenting, the good of my church. Sam, you and I were at that retreat a couple of years ago with our friend John Mark Comer, and he framed that whole conversation with us about, as goes the leader, will go the church. Do you remember that? And he framed up for us, like, the best thing you can give your church is a slower, more patient, calmer, kinder, healthier version of you. He's like, that's the best thing you can give your church. And I suddenly thought, flip, I have to change some stuff. Because I thought what I had to give my church was hard work. Because, I work off the back of people generously giving to my church. That's what pays my bills at the end of the day. So I have to give them hard work in reply. But what he kind of helped me to see that day was, no, you have to give them a slower, different paced person. So I've been trying to practice that ever since then. That would be my story.
And I mean, we'll connect a little bit later, a little bit more depth around this whole intersection between pace of life and living on mission for God. But that very same statement could, I think, resonate for anyone in any vocation, like and as a teacher or as a plumber or as a builder or working in IT or being in charge of a company, that actually the best thing that you can give people, and I think one of the most beautiful witnesses that we can be, is healthy in our life and in our soul, particularly with all the crazy social pressures that go on these days, and just a lot of tribalism and all that sort of thing. So I know for me, like, as I remember my 20s beginning to really get my head around like Sabbath rest, and that sort of came onto my paradigm quite strongly, and I began to work through some of that stuff, which I thought was tricky when I was single in terms of how to outwork that. And then, like, you get married and like, oh, there's another person in the mix that's wired differently than me, and then you have children, and it's like, okay, so I constantly have to rework that. But also I remember, like, what it exposed for me is there was some brokenness in my thinking around value, identity. Like, have you had to work through some stuff like that in terms of like I want to slow down a little bit, but then stuff popping up that has hindered you, or you've realized is a bit broken in terms of your own thinking or wiring, or does that make sense?
Yep, it does. Yeah, heaps of stuff showing up, big time. I want to just probably like slightly untease that process a little bit. Dallas Willard says that, how do we change? So as you're thinking about, okay, I want to become a more evenly paced person. So if that's the goal, how am I going to get there? And he says, you need a vision, you need an intention, and you need a means. So you need a vision, you need an imagination for it. Then you need an intention, you actually need a desire. Man, I do actually want that. Not just, oh, that's a good idea. And then you need means, you need practices. And so I think early on, I went straight to means, I went straight to practice without a vision or an intention.
Brilliant.
So I didn't have an imagination for, let's throw the net out pretty wide. I didn't actually have a vision and an imagination for the good life Jesus has for me. Like I had some ideas, but I didn't have this idea, this imagination that said, what if the good life Jesus wants for me is actually just a good, like slower, more peaceful, my internal world's not all kind of clouded up and messy and chaotic and always frantic and always trying to, be reactionary to stuff. Like, what if that's the good life? And that's kind of when my imagination started to kind of expand. It was like, wow, the Lord actually wants for me as a disciple with him to know that I'm loved deeply and for my life to live as a mirror of that love. And that's the good life. And I had to kind of start there. And I had to start there even with mission, because I thought mission was working hard. I thought mission was saving up and going elsewhere. I thought mission was doing something kind of big and, loud in your community. And I started to realize, what if mission, is just simply giving away that presence to each other? What if it could be that, being a presence in our town, in our cities that looks different?
Like John Mark I love that line, like a non-anxious presence.
Yes.
Like,
great
what
line.
A gift to any space to be a non-anxious presence.
Yeah, great phrase, right? So what if that is my imagination sort of ticking over, and I'm starting to make that my vision, and then intention's the next click, right? So if I have an imagination for it, I then need to start to desire that, and I need to start getting this desire going. And my desire just kind of came from a bunch of things. It came from starting to realize, like, if I don't get this right, my wife's going to be the victim of me not getting this right. If I don't get this right, my kids are not going to, they're going to be the ones that suffer the repercussions of this. My church, like, I was fueled almost by a negative narrative, but in a good way. Like, it's sometimes that pressure is a good thing to just say, hey, there's a cost if I don't get this right. There's a cost to others. So that wasn't a burden on my shoulders. It was almost like an acceptance of the reality of that, a responsibility for that. I actually want my wife, my son, my family around me, my friends to experience that of me. So then means. So Sabbath, that was a big one, like learning to Sabbath. And actually that was really hard. And I had a love-hate relationship with it for a long time. But now after lockdowns, and lockdowns are no Sabbath, baby. Like they're not. There's something else and completely different. Sabbath is to do four things. All right. Sabbath is to stop, to rest, which are different. Stopping and resting are two different things. So stop, to rest, to be replenished, to worship, and to delight. And if I get all those four things together, I'm practicing biblical Sabbath. But just doing one thing, just stopping, that's not biblical Sabbath. That's just stopping. So learning that was hard. The other one that was really cool though, Sam, which I think might apply to some people who are watching this today, is there's another spiritual discipline called watching. I don't know if you've done much of this, but watching is like where Jesus says, consider the birds, for they have everything that they have. Their Father loves them. And like, that's actually a spiritual discipline. So to actually go, I'm going to slow down my life and I'm going to make sure I keep watching. So I'm going to make sure, like my dad does this. He actually puts a bird feeder out their kitchen window. And in the morning, he makes a coffee and he stands looking out the window in the morning all year long, all through the seasons. And he watches the birds and he just meditates on that scripture. consider the birds, for they have everything they need, as their Father in heaven has given to you. You know, like it's like this beautiful practice. So I'd say Sabbath, watching, those are probably two of the most incredible pace setting practices for me. Yeah. Hope that answers what you're asking.
Yeah, I love that, Dan. That's so helpful. Our church knows that when it comes to the watching discipline, one of the things I love watching is my lawn. and similar to your dad, I'd stand there with a coffee and just be like, it's a good lawn. It's currently not a great lawn, actually, and so I went to Mitre 10 because we finally could, and bought some weed and feed, which I do every year. And I looked at the forecast and thought I could get away with it yesterday, but I did it all, and then like 2 hours later it rained. It was like, Jen doesn't even know this. She's going to be hearing this for the first time as she watches this. But and similar to your dad, my grandfather really modelled that for me. Not through anything he taught me in terms of being able to frame it up properly, but I just watched him watch things with pure delight. Yeah. And it was just, it captivated me in terms of what a rich and beautiful way to live. That's so helpful. And so back to this whole thing of mission, it seems, with a lot of our guys are in home churches this week watching the video that John Tyson made on this whole thing of a sacred pace. And going into that session, I was like, oh man, how does pace and mission intersect? Like, this is an interesting subject to have on a course centered around mission. And it was so helpful. A lot of the stuff you've just described really helped me understand that a whole lot more. But do you want to unpack that relationship a little bit more in terms of what it looks like to see the intersection between the mission of God and how we represent him as ambassadors in the world today, and the pace of our life?
I think for me, this pins into Matthew 11. Like that's kind of where I would hang this in a considerable way in my life. Matthew 11, of course, is where, Jesus says, come to me, all who are heavy burdened, and I'll give you rest. But then he also says about this thing of being yoked to him. And you just got to think about that yoke properly for a few moments. Like, being yoked to Jesus is, I think Eugene Peterson paraphrased it by saying, come and I'll show you how to really work, is one of the phrases I think is in there. So work's definitely in there. So there's a sense of like, come with me, walk with me, and I will show you how to work. And it affirms work. And it affirms that we actually are serving a God who is at work in his mission. So Jesus is saying, come be with me and yoke yourself to me and learn the pace. And I've always thought about how sometimes we interpret that as like, something heavy being on our shoulders is when it's out of balance. But actually, I think there's also the lateral movement of that too. Like when we're pushing or pulling is also a weight, if that makes sense. So when we're trying to push on too hard without God's Spirit, and we're going off on our own agenda, and we're pushing off into these kind of like antagonistic corners, I reckon we've gone too far. We've pushed too hard, And also when we're not doing anything, and we feel a kind of tug behind us of Jesus saying, come on, I've called you to a mission. I've called you to loving. I've called you to serving. Like, come on. And we feel the tug from behind. I would say that's similar too. That's the yoke doing its work. So I think, this thing of mission and pace. And I think Tyson's idea of, was it sacred pace?
Yeah, sacred. So he talks about a fatal pace and a fatal pace, yes. And then the sacred pace, and complacent pace, fatal pace, and then the sacred pace.
Because we can with the Spirit, right? That's his phrase.
That's the whole thing of being led by the Spirit. So walking with the Spirit in terms of how we have our pace. Yeah.
So I would say that's probably for me like the paradigm that I hold all that in, as a disciple of Jesus, not even as a pastor. So as a pastor, there's a bunch of weight that gets put on that yoke that you're like, take it off. But as a disciple, I've got neighbors. I've got people literally living on this, street just outside here. We've got 4 neighbors, and I want to live in that yoke with my 4 neighbors. We've got friends through Jimmy's kindy now, my son's kindy. I want to live in that yoke with them. I want to arrive at kindy, dropping off my son and start to have conversations with people. And I want that yoke to be kind of at work. I want to be with Jesus. I want to be being led by the Spirit. I want to be being tugged. And so the pacing of it is just being kind to yourself, but also being attentive to God and walking in that beautiful rhythm there. Yeah.
There's a bit of rage against of machine formation in my life that is pretty deep. And one of the things I think that really spins my tires around the pace of life is just how countercultural this message is. And again, Tyson's critique of like, you've got complacent stuff, so van life and Instagram, you know, sunrises, and we've rejected the, you know, society or whatever in their stupid work ethic. But then I think most folk, you know, sort of fantasize about that but don't live it, and that kind of fatal pace thing, and like just we swim in a culture with the expectations on us. And there's this kind of rage against machine thing in me where I'm like, what does it look like to be this countercultural people who have time and have margin and who haven't said yes to so much stuff that our schedules are bananas, and our souls, as you say, you know, are flourishing and that non-anxious presence. I read something by Preston Sprinkle yesterday, one of his blog posts, and it was challenging. He says, if one of the Na'vi left planet Pandora, cool metaphor, and visited Earth, would they notice a peculiar people? Would they recognize a subsection of humanity marked by self-denial, enemy love, and a countercultural sexual ethic? Or would we blend into the sea of those who are lovers of self, lovers of money, lovers of pleasure, rather than lovers of God? 1 Timothy verse 3. And I think part of that is like, man, I mean, it's a confronting statement, but it gives, for me, vision, like you're talking about earlier, around the sort of community I want to be a part of, and the sort of people I want to be and embody, and the sort of community I want to build in within our little church here at Bay Vineyard. But also that pace thing for me, I'm like, man, like clearly throughout the Old Testament, one of the things that God does is heal people from the thing of slavery, where your values and what you produce. But I'm like, man, how tough is that for us to get the slave out of our inner man or inner woman in terms of our values made on what we produce? And that's where Sabbath is a gift, but it's quite exposing often in terms of that. But yeah, there's part of me, and I know that we had slightly different influences musically growing up, Dan, but does that resonate for you in terms of, like, you know, Walter Brueggemann's, you know, Sabbath is resistance, and the pace, like there's part of me that's like, yeah, it's rock and roll, man, in terms of like a radically, you know, I didn't sign up to be some namby-pamby pastor Christian, you know, I want to be countercultural, man, and in the way of Jesus. Does that resonate for you?
Big time. And I would just say, like, that if we get those practices in the right place, so they're not religious, like they're not sitting over here as something we do to earn God's favor.
So important.
But we wrestle them into the right place and say, I practice Sabbath because in practicing Sabbath, I'm going to be someone who puts my phone down.
Yeah.
Like, that's countercultural. I'm going to not be defined by my production all week long. That's countercultural. Like, so the practice produces something. It puts us in a place to have that experience. And so I'm a bit like you. I like more alternative music, and my upbringing, definitely. I was more of a punk rock fan, and it was the same thing. It was like this subculture, you know, and there was this like DIY practicing nature, and you belonged because of a bunch of markers. You belonged because you liked the music. You belonged because you know, there was like a mutual appreciation there. Like, I like the music seems to like me. But then there's this thing of like, I want to contribute something here. I want to make this. And so there's this DIY nature to it. And you got involved, and you...
Oh, sorry guys, I am having a few technical glitches. Sorry, I lost you there for a second, Dan, and that might have been me. We have to reboot that little section. Sorry, that was my Zoom wigging out again.
Oh, do you want to start from...
So no, you're mutual. So you're talking about the music loved you, and a bit of a DIY thing in there.
Yeah, and so because of that DIY thing, you contributed.
Right.
And because you contribute, you got your hands dirty. You started to learn guitar. Yeah. And you started a band, and you learned some scales so that you could play a song, you know, and all of that meant that you had this beautiful thing out the other side. You played some music, but there was all of this work of learning scales and learning about gear and all of that. It was all part of the picture. And I think we just have to realize that's what practices are trying to do. You know, a practice of Sabbath is to learn the scales of rest.
Brilliant.
So that you can contribute into the world in a beautiful way. The point is not that the church should just be filled with a great bunch of Sabbathers or watchers. It's that would be people on mission. And the way we're formed in that is by learning these scales of these things.
Yeah. And that's where, like, the you know, our framework, I know we've talked a lot about this around discipleship, to be with Jesus and to become like Jesus and to do what Jesus would do if he was you, wherever he's got you. That whole thing of becoming like Jesus in terms of the pace of life is intimately connected with the whole thing of then doing what Jesus would do, because we have something to offer from that, the deeper wells of a rested soul, and someone that's learning to grow in that loving union with God and finding healing in that place. Hey, as we land, Dan, you know, I'm sorry that you're still in lockdown, mate. You know, we're in sort of level 2, you know, and we're getting used to wearing all these things. And but I know that must be tough for you guys up there, still being in lockdown. But for our context, people are changing gears, and everyone's back at work now, and but the lockdown and the sudden pivots and changes and uncertainty is tiring, and it's stressful. I'm very aware of that as a pastor, and as I think of my wonderful little crew, you know, engaging this morning, it's like, you know, my heart goes out to them. But I just know that there's a wise way of again, connected with pace. But what was your advice pastorally around how we can navigate out of, again, another change, another level, all that sort of thing, and be refreshed and replenished, and do that intentionally and with some wisdom over these next weeks?
It's a great question, Sam, and I think we're all in the middle of that still. So I don't think we should stop asking that question. These lockdowns and the alert changes, it's a learning curve, and it just keeps throwing us in all kinds of different directions, like any learning curve does. So we're all learning new things, whether it's trying to live within the new adjustments to the level 2, et cetera, or whether, you know, in Auckland, we've lived with the pressure of another lockdown could come at any minute for quite a long time now. You know, like that's a reality for us. So you're always living with that pressure. So I would say, if there's this like learning curve and this thing that's like tiring you, that's kind of the reality of life, then you need to name that and go, I'm living with that. That would be my first thing. And then I would say, and then find a countercultural practice with Jesus that's going to kind of emerge every day to just remind you that that's the reality. We're not getting rid of it, but I'm going to try and seek a way of being in it well. So for me, what that's meant is I read one chunk of scripture all week. So I just read a certain psalm, and I don't move from that psalm. I read it every morning, and I read it all week. So this week I've been doing Peter's declaration. Okay, so all week I've just been sitting with Peter and Jesus having this interaction, and Jesus saying, well, who do you say I am? And Peter saying, you're the Messiah, like all of this. And then Jesus says to Peter, and you're my rock, you know, like I rename you. So I've just been sitting with that all week. So all week, and amongst all of these ups and downs of so many things that are changing, and another 1 o'clock address and another mask thing, and, you know, the numbers of this, all week I'm sitting with the same scripture. And it just helps me to just sit and just go slowly. And sometimes I might post about that publicly. Most often I don't. I'm just sitting with my own notebook, my own journal, my own prayer. And what I love, and this would be a little bit of a throw the line out a bit further, I would say read a psalm and spend all week in that psalm and just keep praying that psalm. Like just let it be a prayer. Even if you read it and you're like, oh, I don't actually feel like life's that bad. Just realize that the psalm's inviting you to see something of humanity that someone else might be feeling, or you might feel one day, and just sit with it. Let it soak in, you know, where a psalmist says, you know, I spent all night crying my tears into my pillow. You might be thinking, well, I'm not feeling that way today. I was feeling that way a few weeks ago, but I'm not feeling that way now. Move on. I would say, don't move on. Stay there. Just let it sit well with you. I think that's what the Lord's doing in this moment. I think it's an invitation to just slow down and go deep in a world where we're so used to just scrolling stuff quickly, reading little snippets and moving on. What if you could read a piece of scripture slowly all week, in amongst all the ups and downs? that's going on around you. That would just be shooting from the hip. That would be one bit of advice.
Oh, I love that. Slow down and go deep. Oh, damn, that's a goodie. Just as we finish, I love that framework around vision, intention, and method was the last one.
It means to do it. Yeah.
And I want to encourage our guys, because I know that, you know, for me and you, Dan, as we've been friends for a long time now, that we can, we're passionate about this stuff because we know that the fruit's worth it. And our church knows that I joke all the time about Rachel Hunter's famous line, "It won't happen overnight, but it will happen." And I'm like, man, when it comes to having a vision for this, like how you want your soul to feel and what the flourishing life walking with Jesus and being yoked to him looks like, which includes participating in his sufferings, feeling what Jesus feels for the broken world around us and all the rest of it. But then having that intention, like I want that. And we're in a time of history where that's been tested for every Christian. Do you want it? But then having the means to be able to do it. My thing is like, keep chipping away at the means once you've got that vision and intention, because it won't happen overnight, but it will drip feed, like your soul will be replenished. It's a drip feed of flourishing. And have you had a sabbatical, Dan?
No, because when I was about time for sabbatical, we planted our church, and now I'm in church period time again. But,
we're 100% my story.
But I think, like, I'm all for sabbaticals. I'm all for that season. But I think what Sabbath has done for me it's meant I'm living in a different rhythm now as a pastor. Yeah. Even tracking towards that.
100%.
Like, completely different. So
yeah. Well, I'm the same. I mean, 100% same story. Like every time we moved churches, we would do the sabbatical, and didn't get it. So. But I'm like, man, I've actually feel so good. You know, overall, I feel really good. And I think it's because, well, I know it's because of like Jesus has given me this vision. I've wanted it and I've chosen it. And then I've even though I've fallen off the wagon so many times with the means, I've gone, screw it. I'm going to keep getting back and I'm going to get back on the wagon because that vision is burning in my heart now. And then you start to experience it, and especially for me over this lockdown, our church knows that I've just felt this peace, this inner peace. It has had nothing to do with my external world. People have been a bit annoyed with me. You know, we've had lots of social issues that have come up, and I know you've engaged with that stuff. We've had the kids at home and a bit of stress. You're like, I've literally felt his peace, and it's been like, this should, you know, my mental health's historically really vulnerable. And it's like, oh man, this stuff works, it turns out. You know? Hey, can you pray for us, Dan, as we finish? And thank you so much for your time, man. Just so much epic wisdom there, bro. And I'm so grateful for this yarn.
My pleasure, bro. I'd love to pray. Yeah, let's pray. Father of love, you invite us to come in prayer with this invitation and say, come to me as Father. And so we start there. Father, the one who wants the best for his children, who wants the best for his creation, the one whose loving gaze is turned towards us. God, who is like the prodigal father who stands at the end of the driveway. To that God, we pray today. And we just sit and we slow down. And we start here. We are loved by you, God. You have loved us first by sending your Son as Christ into the world. The incarnation, the display of love. And you have suffered, you have endured, you have modeled, you have invited, you have declared, you have put all of these things in place that we would be people of that way of life. And so, God, we start by setting our gaze into this vision of love, this good life. And I pray for each person at Bay Vineyard. I pray for each person watching this kōrero today. I pray that something of this moment might spark and help and encourage and call us towards living a little bit more in the reality of that love, that loving way. I pray for that today, Lord, that this way of peace and shalom, this way of your kingdom, would be our big, beautiful story that we live in. And I pray for Napier, and I pray for that whole region. I pray that Bay Vineyard would be known as people who live in that big, beautiful story of a God of love, and peace, and grace towards creation. Lord, equip this church to be people who embody that and live that, who live it into their neighborhoods and into their streets and into their schools, embody this message of love and peace, and that it would be lived in beautiful ways, tactile and tangible ways on mission into the corners of the town and the city. Lord, by your Spirit, I ask these things. By your Spirit, empower, equip, and gift, that they may be able to do this. From afar, I ask these things. I send my love. I pray these things in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Amen.